In this update, we're going to be going over my latest winter thoughts on this upcoming winter. If you recall, we first got classified in an El Nino back on June the 8th, and that typically signifies these well above average sea surface anomalies out here in the equatorial Pacific. But it's been plenty hot across the Atlantic as well. And look at all the red on the map, all the way through the Atlantic and all the way through the Caribbean. And even the Gulf of Mexico has more or less been untouched. And only recently we've seen some upwelling from some recent storms. So it's been very active. In fact, we've had 17 storms already, and we still have 2 months left. And that's going to be a driving force even going into the winter months, because we still are looking to expect a moderately strong El Nino. Right now, it's about 1.2. So it's been holding steady. So anytime you get below a 1, that's favored on kind of the weaker side. Anytime you're within that 1.0 and 1.5, that's more or less in the moderate side. You go above 1.5 is getting into the moderate to kind of stronger type criteria. And I think that's where this winter is going to end up. But it's definitely going to be an El Nino through winter and really all the way through spring. And the latest Enzo update kind of, confirms that, with nearly 95% probability this El Nino is going to be with us through January, February, and March, and even still an 80% probability it continues all the way through the spring months. So we'll be talking about El Nino type impacts for the foreseeable future. So if you are new to the channel and like detailed weather breakdowns, hit the subscribe button and you're in. You get all my daily content on this channel, and I would love to reach 200,000 subscribers by the end of the month, and you can help me get there by subscribing to the channel and following all my daily content. So let's take a look at the latest CFS V2, because this has been a trend that pretty much been continuing. Recall, we are in that moderate criteria, and that's exactly where this latest update puts us at. We're anywhere between 1.0 to 1.5. So right now, the latest guidance kind of hinting at likely a moderate to, if not kind of a stronger type El Nino. And if that occurs, here's the breakdown. So if you take a look at some of the analogs, if you take a look at all the moderately to strong, El Ninos since 1950, you come up with these years. And really 1957, 58, some of the standouts is 72, 73, back in 2002, 2009. So those are the standouts for the moderately strong El Ninos. And here's the overall temperature anomalies for November through January during those moderately to strong El Ninos. And here's the chart, the temperature chart on the bottom of the screen. And it's been predominantly, so you have a much less active polar jet to the north, and you got a little bit more pronounced subtropical jet to the south. So you can definitely see the trend, and our southern flank has been below average during those years into California, into the Four Corners regions, back into New Mexico, into Texas, going all the way through portions of the southeast, and further to the north. That trend into the north central states has been above average across the Great Lakes, across portions of the Ohio Valley and portions of the mid-Atlantic, as well as in a good chunk of New England. And as far as the precipitation front through that November, January timeframe, we've seen the trend of wetter than average just along the coast, only the coastal areas, not inland, but definitely the more active subtropical jet across the south, through Texas, through Oklahoma, through portions of Missouri, back into Arkansas, into Louisiana and Mississippi, back into Florida, into Georgia, into South Carolina, and parts of hugging the coast, going all the East Coast, seeing that as above average precipitation during that November through January timeframe. The rest of the country, where you see it's white, it hasn't been predominantly above or below. It's been kind of neutral during those timeframes. And if we trend through December through February, we see the kind of the trend continue. And one of the noticeable things is it's actually getting a little bit colder and getting a little bit more pronounced across the south, as more areas across our western regions, across the Four Corners regions, into the deserts, into Colorado, into Oklahoma again, even the deeper, darker blues showing up into South Texas, back into Florida again. Much of the southeast remains overall below average during that, December to February timeframe, kind of the heart of winter. And to the north, overall kind of above average. So you'll have, less probabilities and, higher than average anomaly temperature anomalies during that time frame over the course of that December to February timeframe. And if you look at the precipitation, again, on the West Coast, that trend kind of continues more or less on the wetter side. So you start off winter on the wetter side across the western regions, along the coastal regions, and then continue, on the wetter side across a good part of Texas and a much of the southeast again. So you remain cooler and wetter overall. And then further north, again, more likely neutral conditions with a pocket of below average precipitation across portions of Michigan and through portions of the Ohio Valley. And if we trend through January to March, this is kind of the deepest, coldest parts of winter. You see the darker blues across the South. That's when it's a lot more prevalent and more pronounced, with the harshest winter across the South as the subtropical jet is lowering. You'll have these overrunning type setups, likely some icy type setups, and then that's when you'll have a lot more transitioning to snow as well across these regions, across the deep South and much of the middle of the country. While much of the north, you notice it's not as pronounced. You're still overall on the warmer side, overall, but it's not as above average like you've seen to start off the winter months across portions of the north. And then as we transition to the precipitation front, you kind of see the same thing. So you have a lessening front across the Pacific Northwest. California definitely stays on the wetter side, and you start to dry out now. You start to typically kind of drier than average conditions start to impede these areas across the Four Corners regions and much of the middle of the country. Not more pronounced on the above the below, just more of the neutral side, staying on the wetter side for the portions of the deep South, and continue to be on the wetter side across Florida and across portions of the southeast, while much of the Ohio Valley, parts of Kentucky and parts of of Tennessee start to overall kind of dry out as well. So here's the transition as we go into the February. And typically February, at least for the areas in the South, are definitely one of the coldest times of the year. That's when your temperature is already at the coldest, right? And then you have more successful cold fronts. So overall, it's going to be continuing to be below average, but likely going to be more pronounced for a good part of the US, really. So notice the trend. It kind of starts more or less above average for the north, but it's not as pronounced as you get deeper into winter. So it's going to be likely a more active second half of winter than the first half of winter, especially across areas to the north and much of the Ohio Valley in the northeast. I think it just continues all winter long with more cloudier days, rainier days, and then of course when it gets cold enough, you'll have increased snow amounts across the deep South. It's one of those winters that the snow line could actually reach all the way down to the I-10 corridor. It's one of those winters that it's the likelihood of that happening, because you'll have more successful cold fronts reaching pretty far south, and they'll kind of stall out, and then you'll have more options of colder air pushing further south, and you just have more opportunities of these overrunning type setups with the leading cold air and these trailing systems that come on the backside that typically lead to favorable snow events for the deep South. And I think those are going to be a little bit more pronounced. And what you'll see is, and we kind of got a preview of that already for this, I think, Ophelia. Remember, Ophelia was formed off a little bit of low pressure off a stalled frontal boundary and developed this low, and then it went up the coast. We had ridging over the top, and I think that's kind of a preview of these systems and what you'll kind of see going deeper into the winter months. You'll get a lot more of these systems as the storm track will be more or less across these regions across the South, and then really activate once they go up the East Coast. And then I think we're going to get some pretty big snow events across the East Coast this year with this particular setup going forward. And if we look at the overall precipitation anomalies, we kind of find ourselves with the kind of the same thing, right? It starts to, the second half starts to dry out on into the Pacific Northwest, and the above average continues to be further south into California, across Nevada, into Arizona. And then once you hit Texas again, still continue to be favorable on the wetter side, and as much as the Southeast and Florida again continues to be on the wetter side. And you see the transition of these storms of likely coming up the East Coast, continuing to be on the wetter side and likely to be on the much more snowier side. So if you look at some of the weakest El Ninos back from 1950 to 2009, if it does happen to trend a little bit lower into the weaker side, here's the graph. So the graph is, you got the average snowfall over those winters. The darker blues is about 10 inches above average. The lighter darker browns about 10 inches below average. And if we did in fact have a kind of a weaker El Nino, which I'm not really favoring, we would have above average snows across the Ohio Valley, a little bit lighter snows, less than average across portions of the Pacific Northwest. And either way, across the South, you would still be above average, even into a typical weaker El Nino. But more favorable is going to be more of a stronger type El Nino, more of a moderate to strong type El Nino. And if that does actually come to fruition, you see a lot more deeper, darker blue show up across the South. So I think this is one of those years that areas across the South are going to get more than average of snowfall than what you typically see. And these areas across the South typically only average about a couple of inches a season. So this is, if you're a snow lover across the South, in some years you never even see snow for many, many years. It's just going to be one of those years. I think it's going to be a lot more pronounced, and you'll be able to see snow in places that you likely haven't seen in a lot of years with this upcoming winter, and more favorable for areas across the South. It's not like you don't get any snow across the North. You get plenty of it. It just won't be as evident. You'll likely be below average for a good most of the winter across the Great Lakes and across the Ohio Valley and portions of the interior mid-Atlantic. I think the coastal regions will actually be above average this year with on the overall snow front. And if we take a look at kind of all the events, all the El Ninos over the years, this kind of sums it up. So this applies the stronger and the weaker, all the events of the El Ninos. Regardless, with an El Nino, you're still going to be favorable across the deep South for much of California, Nevada, into Utah, into Arkansas, into Colorado, into New Mexico, into Nebraska, into Kansas, as well as into Oklahoma and Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, back into Mississippi and Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and up the East Coast is likely to be more favorable for a snowier winter. It's not really until you get to the far extremes interior regions across the Great Lakes. I think your lake effects is going to be a lot less prevalent this year, and you'll just be overall higher than average anomalies across the Great Lakes and across our northern states of the Dakotas and Minnesota. And I think these areas will be overall not as snowy as you typically see on an average winter. So guys, I appreciate you guys watching. Do like this video, definitely hit the subscribe button, and catch my next update where I protect you before and after the storm.